The triple barrel is a difficult but mandatory strategy for you to master if you want to succeed at poker. That said, you can't do it every single time you have nothing. Far too many people continuation bet the flop, break the turn, and then think they have to bluff because that's their only way to win the pot. And if you do that, you are going to be torching your money. Fortunately for you, poker coaching coach extraordinaire Justin Saliba has spent countless hours going through lots of high-level GTO solver content to become incredibly precise at turn and river bluffs. And today, I'm very happy to bring you his top tips for when you should continue barreling on the turn. Let's get right to it.
Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going to be talking about when to barrel the turn. So this spot is going to be a bit different than the turn probe strategy where it goes check, check. Now we're going to focus on when we're the in-position player, we bet the flop, the opponent calls, and now we get to the turn, and we're deciding when to barrel, and what hand types, what frequencies, etc. So similar focus to before, we're going to start with global frequency in our mind, and then build our turn strategies with choosing good hand types. So obviously we know that if we're betting everything on the turn, hand type doesn't matter, right? You're just betting everything. And as that scale goes down in global frequency, you have to be choosier and choosier in what makes a good hand choice, a good candidate to barrel the turn. So starting with global frequency, what happens in these turn barrel spots that's a bit different than in other spots is that a lot of the times on the flop we're betting at a high frequency. So I would say that in most cases we're betting our range or very high frequency of our range on the flop. And the opponent's getting to fold out a lot of their air and continue with a much stronger range. So why do we get to bet a lot on the flop? That's because of our equity advantage. Well, now once we get to the turn, equities are going to run a lot closer together. And when equities run closer together, our aggression in general is going to come from our nut advantage. We're going to be leaning into the fact that we didn't get check raised. So the opponent's turn call strategy or flop call turn check strategy against us is typically quite condensed and quite capped. And so we're going to push our advantage at the high end of our range using big bet sizes in general. If you identify how the turn interacts with your range, that's going to allow you to scale that frequency over. On great turn cards for you, you're going to bet an extremely high frequency, even up to 100% of the time. Compare that to a lot of the bad turns. These are going to be the ones where your opponent's actually able to develop leads. And then when they check, we need to be quite careful on that. How we're going to sort out our sizing in this turn barrel strategy is that we're going to try to keep in mind that in general, we want to use a big size. In general, equities run quite close. We're pushing that nut advantage. We're going to bet with a polarized range. That is, we're going to adapt from that, but that I would say is a good default strategy. Now, in terms of hand choice, this is going to look a lot different than the turn probe video that we started with. When you're choosing good hands to barrel the turn, your desire for equity is going to be much less, right? When you're at deep stacks, you're still going to want equity in plenty of spots. But in typical tournament stack depths, I'm going to say 40 and lower, you're actually going to be much more focused on having no equity or low equity hands that barrel the turn. Now, why is this? Well, first off, when you're playing in position, realizing that equity and being able to check back the turn changes everything. When you're out of position, if you check, you still have to face aggression with that hand type. Whereas in position can just check and realize 100% of their equity. And so that is extremely useful on the turn. We also don't want to get, imagine we bet with a medium equity hand and we get jammed on, like a medium draw. Well, now we have to fold out this equity. So number one, realizing your equity is extremely important when we're the in-position player because we can check and see a river. The second thing is that we want to focus on unblocking the region of our opponent's folding range. And what we're going to find when we go through some spots is that typically your draws are going to interact with your opponent's turn folds. And so when you're out of position and it goes check, check, like in the last video, we want to bet that equity because we're actually blocking continues a lot of the time. But when we're the in-position player and we barrel that equity, now we're actually blocking a lot of the opponent's folding range. So we're going to find plenty of checks with higher equity hands in the turn to realize our equity. And when we build that polar range on the turn, we're going to focus on unblocking the opponent's folds and having little equity that we don't mind bet folding. Those are, I would say, are going to be two of my biggest triggers in terms of developing my or pulling hands for my hand choice.
Are you a shark or a fish? Well, I'm very excited to introduce Peak GTO and the very first poker ELO score. You can battle against the bots and see how you fare, while at the same time improving your skills and leveling up from a student to a shark. Get started with Peak GTO for free right now.
To start, let's look at what I would call like a bread and butter spot. We're going to focus on this 30 big blind stack depth. King, 10, 4. Okay, so this is going to be a typical spot where we just have 55% equity in position, right? Or sorry, 65. not 55. Way more than 55% equity. We have a massive equity advantage on King, 10, 4. And so we get to bet our entire range here. And what happens is the opponent folds almost half of their range. They fold out all of this air. So when they call and we get to a turn, let's just start with a deuce of spades. This is a brick, and now look at the equities. So we went from having a massive equity advantage to now equities running extremely close. And when equities run close, what happens to our overall frequency? Well, it gets pulled back, right? It gets pulled back to the middle where when the opponent checks, we can't just bet everything. We need to be choosy, because where is our advantage? Where's our asymmetry now? Well, now our asymmetry is in the nutted region of our range. Now we have more ace king, we have more aces, we have more king queen, we have more king jack, we have more king 10. Why is that? First off, pre-flop. The big blind's not going to just call aces, ace king pre-flop. And second off, they're going to check raise the flop with a lot of their best hands. And so when they don't check raise and we arrive at this turn, equities run extremely close because the opponent folded their air. So they have something, whereas we have a lot more hands that are nothing. But where's our advantage? Our advantage is the high-end equity of our range, and so we're going to focus on that, and we're going to build our strategy from there. So when we do that, our frequency is going to be in the middle, and we're going to use a big size. Now when we go to hand type, what you're going to find here is that it's not so much the draws that are always betting in this spot. Queen jack is finding a very reasonable amount of checks. Ace jack, ace queen is doing the same. Now, what hands are betting at a higher frequency? You have ace 2, which is a pretty interesting one here, blocking the turn 2 pair. But in general, like if this is a 3, your ace low card is going to be a pretty good hand to barrel the turn with. Another great one that's going to be kind of like a trigger for us is your worst offsuit ace-x. Your worst offsuit ace-x also typically develops quite a bit of aggression. And so we're a bit more polar here, right? We're taking the queen 8 suited, the jack 8 suited. We're taking the 9-7 suited, 8-7, 6-7, right? This is what I'm going to call our no equity hands or low equity hands. Now, if we look at how our diamonds play, of the 9-7s, 9-7 of diamonds is the one that's checking. Why is that? That's because we can just check back and realize our equity. We do not want to bet, open up the action, and get jammed on when we have 9 high diamond draws. We have a very reasonable amount of equity here. We have 25% equity in this spot. And to have to fold that out when we're in position and can just realize that fully is a big issue. So this is, I would say, the most common way to approach turn barrels is kind of in this manner where we're focused on choosing our best hands and our low equity bluffs, especially at this mid stack depth. So what other turns can we look at here? Let's look at draw completing. So in terms of size, what I'll say is that the more polar we are, the bigger size we're going to use on the turn. And so on a deuce, it's a very brick. It's very much a brick, right? And so we're finding some pots and some B67. So essentially how I'll play this in game is I'm going to just choose a big size, right? I'm going to choose one size, maybe like 85% pot, and be pretty happy with that. But as draws complete, equities become a bit more rigid, and they're not going to change as much from turn to river. And so size typically shifts down slightly, right? So if we compare this to like an offsuit queen, well, now we turn straights. Now equity is a bit more rigid, draws have completed, and now you can see there's no pot size bet, we're just betting the 67% size. That's going to be a very common move, essentially, that the solvers teach us and that we should apply in game, is that when equity becomes more stagnant, and we have more equity on the turn, like in this spot, we have a little bit more equity than on a brick, that size shifts a bit down. Let's look at how like a diamond would play. maybe like a 5 of diamonds. So this should shift our size down as well a bit. Same kind of thing, right? Now we're finding almost a little bit of even small bets. And what's happening with that? Well, the board's not as dynamic, and we want to bet more of our range. And so we still want to bet a hand like king queen, king jack at a reasonable frequency here, but we don't want to put all the money in, right? There's no need to like play this very polar big size bet strategy where I'm saying I have the nuts or I have air, because now we have way more hands that fall into this category of like, okay, top pair. Well, top pair is really good on the deuce of spades, but it's not so good on the 5 of diamonds. And so that shifts our bet size to be a bit smaller. So another turn card in this kind of scenario that is a bit different is going to be like an ace. And on the ace, we should shift down, right? Because what we need to think about, what is shifting our bet size down? Okay, one, we want to bet more medium strength hands, and 2, just straight up equity. On the flop, when we have a big equity advantage, we're betting very often and typically for a small size. The same thing is going to happen on the turn. It's just going to be a lot less frequent. It's going to be a ton less frequent because when you raise the low jack and the big blind calls, you have so many flops that are amazing for you and you can go ahead and bet. Whereas when you bet and they call, they have something. And so how many turns are there where they have something, but they're just going to be amazing for you? It doesn't come up as often, but it does come up on a board, on a card like the ace, right? On the ace, we just turn a lot more equity. We have very little air now, right? We have very, very little air, and we're just kind of mashing this board with this massive region of offsuit ace-x that we have just a big advantage of straights, of 2 pairs, of good top pair hands. And so that's leaning us to bet at a very high frequency, and our size is just being dragged down, right? It's just going a bit smaller. So, all right, let's go through the same process, and let's go to a bit of a tougher spot. This, I would say, is like a bread and butter spot. When we're the low jack, we have a quite tight range, so it's a bit easier to kind of figure out our frequencies and build our strategy. When we move button to big blind, things get a bit tougher. So let's look at jack of clubs, 5 of hearts, 4 of spades. Okay, so this is a mediocre board for us. We have 56% equity. We're still developing quite a bit of aggression here. We have plenty of good offsuit. Jack X, over pairs. We interact with the 5 and the 4 at least a reasonable frequency. So we're betting at a reasonable frequency, typically for a small size. Let's look at like a 10 of spades. So we'll look at a bunch of turns like we did the previous example, but this to me is a great spot because it shows you the lack of importance of equity and how important it is to unblock the opponent's folding region and not interact with that region. So now we're playing a button range, so we have way more. We have many more combos to choose from. So as a baseline, I guess I start with frequency, right? We bet the flop, they call. They have no air, or they have a lot less air rather, and equities are going to run closer on the turn. What that's going to do is that's going to lead to a slightly higher check frequency and a polar size on average. And that's what we're seeing here. Now, in this Jack 5-4 spot, we checked some on the flop. So you can imagine that if we bet range on the flop, our check frequency on the turn is going to be even higher because our range that we get here with is a bit weaker. But now that we're on the button, we have a lot of hands to choose from. And what we see is that, what are our clear draws here? Well, 6-7, 8-6, 8-7 are playing almost a pure check strategy. This is so much different than turn probes, right? Where turn probes, you're going to want to have that equity when we're putting money on the turn. And what do we go for instead? Well, we want to have queen 3, king 2, king 3, ace 2. We want the lowest card possible in our range, 9-6, right? Our suited 6s, our suited 7s. If we look at our spades have a higher check frequency than other suits. Why is that? Because we can check back and realize our equity. Let's look at what happens when we pot the turn. Where is our opponent's folding range really being derived from? It's being derived from a 6, 7, and 8, and 9, if we look at this, right? So we are looking for the opponent to have that 8-7, 8-6, 7-6 off. These are a lot of combos of folds, right? Suited 9x, the floated flop, offsuit 9x, the floated flop. We want to do everything we can to unblock that region of hands. So if you give us a 2 in our hand, a 2, like a king 2 suited, is just such a lovely barrel on the turn when we're in position here, because it's unblocking that entire folding range. And once again, if we get jammed on, which we will 10% of the time, we have a very, very simple fold with king 2. Whereas if we bet a hand like 7-8 and get jammed on, that really sucks. You know, look at how much equity we have. We have 45% equity with the combo draw, but 30% equity with just like 8-7 here. You know, 6-7, 8-6. Like this is a real amount of equity that we have, and it's very clear that we're blocking all those folds. So I think that this is a cool example I oftentimes think back to. And the reason why your hand choice is so important here is that in the check line, now on a lot of medium to high EV rivers for the OOP player, we're still actually going to make the nuts, which is going to allow us to be really, really hard to play against. Like when we bet small on the Jack 5-4, and the turn is the 10 of spades, and we play check on a 8-7-6 3 deuce. If we make strong hands, that's just going to be so difficult to play against for our opponent. The other thing that I'll say here is that if we can't control these turn frequencies, it's not only going to hurt us on the turn, but it's going to compound and become really difficult for us to control our river frequencies. So I think that this is I really like this example. It's a cool thing in my head to even be like, okay, like how do I control these frequencies? We see like king 7 off, right? King 7 off is finding a very heavy bet, and 8-7 suited is finding a very heavy check. And that is how this spot is going to operate at a very high level in these turn barrel spots. So let's go back and let's look at low jack. There we go. Low jack versus big blind again. And let's go, we just did jack. I'm going to skip this one. Let's do a 9-6 deuce. So we looked at one of these boards, in the turn probe section. And once again, we're finding a spot that is pretty mediocre equity-wise for us. This is low jack versus big at 30. But we have this nut advantage, overpair advantage, which gives us a boost, essentially, of using this bigger size. And let's go with this big size. So we go for this 4.1. For me personally, I think I just play a pure like B55 here and don't really split size on the flop. I think that's going to lead to a pretty reasonable strategy, but not here to talk too much about flop play. So now when you think about, okay, in terms of our global frequency, well, when do we have high global turn barrel frequency? It's going to be on high EV turns. So on a board like this, we have a lot of really high EV turns, right? Any overcard is just going to give us a massive asymmetry of top pair. So if we look at just like a brick queen is just going to give us so many. We have queen jack off, queen 10 off, king queen off, ace queen off. We have so many hands now, and our equity actually goes up, right? So we always need to be thinking about how equities are shifting. All poker is a game of shifting equity and dynamic equity, understanding how it's going to shift and what to do when it shifts. And that's kind of what's happening here, where on an overcard, we can just be so aggressive with it. We're still using this big size, pushing our top pair advantage now. Same should happen on a jack. Slightly less, but similar. King. Same, right? Just extremely aggressive. We're still retaining this like 56% of equity on the turn. It's such a terrible run out for the big blind player to defend against. It's so hard. Ace should be a little less, right? Because the opponent now has plenty more ace-x than they do jack, queen, kings. And so now if we look at this, right, we're finding a little bit of checks. You can still probably just bet close to everything here. But what a computer's going to show us here is like, look at our checks, right? Your jack 8 of clubs is like the one that's finding the check. The queen 8 of clubs. King queen of clubs at mixed frequency, right? So we're finding that we don't want to block those folds, right? The king 7, king 8 is worse than just having king jack here, because the opponent's folds are coming from that 8-7-5, right? And so we don't want to block the opponent's folding range, and we don't want to bet fold our equity. If we kind of keep that in mind for all these spots, it's just going to be, we're just going to have a much simpler time controlling our frequencies. And if you control your frequencies on the turn, your river strategy just becomes much easier to control. If you're constantly putting too much money in on the turn with these different kind of hand types, you're just going to show up on the river with too much air, and it's going to be very difficult to play rivers. So the last example I want to look at, let's go to like 40 bigs maybe, is I want to talk about hand selection on mediocre turns where essentially like your range shape is dictating all these things for you. So let's look at like an EP. So what I'll say is like EP versus big blind. EP is a much tighter range, and when you're playing with much tighter range, you have to grab from more hands. And so a 3 high card board is an extremely good board for EP. We have very little air, and we're kind of just like mashing this board. So we go for this big bet at a very high frequency, and the opponent folds 66% of their range. They are just getting massacred here, right? Such a good board for us. Let's just go brick 6, okay? So now equities run close. They had to massively overfold MDF on the flop because it's such a high EV board for us that we're gonna massively overrealize our equity. Now we get a brick, equities run close. We're gonna use that big size, right? We're gonna use this medium to big size because equities are running close. And so now we're just pushing that high-end equity advantage. But where do we pull hands from, right? In this spot, we don't have a ton of just like if you gave me queen 2 suited, I would love that on this turn, right? That's just going to be a super easy barrel. If I just tell the computer, hey, for some reason I open queen 2 suited, that one's going to be one that finds that easy barrel. But in this case, we don't have that. And so where do you have to grab from? You're grabbing from your low pairs. They're all unblocking the diamond folds. So our focus here is unblocking folds and having very little equity, essentially. Obviously, there's going to be spots where, like the queen 10, there's going to be plenty of spots where we do want to have equity, especially at 40 bigs in this kind of spot. But in general, we do not want to interact with the folding range. That's going to come from our low pairs with the diamond, without the diamond in them. When we go for this barrel size here, look at all these folds. We're just making them fold those diamond draws in the turn. Queen X, some 10X, some offsuit 10X, specifically with the extra draw added. And so when we have pocket threes, we do a pretty reasonable job of that. Now, what happens when it's the cutoff that opens and not the under the gun player? Well, when the cutoff opens against the big blind, I think it was King Jack 10. Very aggressive again. Massive equity advantage. We have less equity. Why? Because we opened a wider range. When we're EP versus big blind, we're going to naturally just have a bit more equity in these kind of spots. But we still have a massive equity advantage. Now we look at the 6 of spades. And what's going to happen is our middling pairs should not be bluffing as much, right? We're having to control these frequencies a bit more. Our lowest pairs are mixed frequencies now. Why is that? We have queen 4. We have queen 5. We have the 6x. We have plenty of 6x that now blocks their turn 2 pair. And so we have better bluffing candidates, better bluffing properties when we get into the spot. And so those hands take precedent. Now, once again, if we think about it as a scale of global frequency, if we're betting at 80% frequency, well, all these hands are going to become pure, right? And so it's all about like dragging that scale through where threes without a diamond are going to be the one we want to barrel here. And as we have more equity, as we have a bigger nut advantage, as we get to develop a higher global frequency, all of a sudden those shifts go from mixed frequencies to pure. And then we're going to be just checking like kind of our worst candidates, right? When we go for this 9.6 size, that's what we looked at last time. Think about where their folding range is coming from. It's coming from the ace X, it's coming from their low diamonds, and it's coming from the queen X. We don't love interacting with that. And if we can do a better job to not interact with that, put a 6 in our hand. This is going to be a typical concept where when we block that turn 2 pair on high EV spots where we have the nut advantage, we can kind of go crazy. This is going to be even more true as stack depths get deeper and blocking those two pairs become more important. The nice thing about blocking the two pairs is that it also naturally is going to unblock the opponent's folding range, right? So yeah, that's a turn barreling spiel a little bit. I'm only 20 minutes in. I kind of want to go a couple more examples. Let's look at another 25 big blind late position spot and just go through kind of a different board type, and focus on frequency, size, which I feel like are a little bit easier in this kind of spot, and then also hand choice. Hand choice to me is the toughest in this spot, whereas in turn probes, I think it's way more about frequency and size because there's a lot more dynamic behavior with that. So 10-7-4, we go for the big bet. What's going to be the highest EV turn for us? Got to be an overcard, right? Which one? So we went big. Queen of spades. Queen of spades, we have 56% equity. Can we get more on that in the ace? 59% equity in the ace. Yeah. So look at that, right? When you get that high EV turn, you're extremely aggressive. You don't care about your hand choice. You're just like, this is the best turn card in the deck for me. My global frequency gets pulled to 100. I bet everything. I do want to look at that queen. I don't think we bet everything anymore, but it's going to be close. Let's let it think for a second. So we have a little less equity. It's going to be a little bit higher frequency of check, right? And so now we're just checking our essentially like worst barreling candidates. What are our worst barreling candidates? 5s and 6s, like our most marginal hands that are blocking the opponent's folds, which is a 5 and 6 in my hand. 9s, finding some of that too. Ace 4, King 4, and then a hand like Jack 9, right? Now, a hand like Jack 9 has equity, but why is it so bad? It has this medium amount of equity that we do not want to bet fold. We can just check back and realize our equity. Let's make it slightly worse. So on a draw completing turn, our bet size should naturally move a little bit down. The overcard is still very nice for us, but now our check frequency goes even higher, right? What are your high frequency checks? Same kind of things, right? 5, 6s, 8s, 9s. Our marginal hands are very naturally going to find checks. Our bet size is a pure 60 now, whereas on a total brick, let's just test this out. On a pure deuce, I'm not sure if we have the stack depth to go bigger than a pure 60. Yeah, we at a deeper stack depth, this is going to lead to a slightly bigger size, more polar range. But let's look at hand choice here, right? What are some of our best bluff candidates? King 3, Queen 5, King 5, Ace 5, Ace 6 off, Ace 8 off. When we barrel, we're doing our absolute best. Ace 3 finding checks, right? We don't need the equity there. When we barrel here, where's the opponent's folds? It's going to come 5, 6, 8, 9. 5, 6, 8, 9. I want to do things to avoid those cards the best I can. And if you put a 3 in my hand, I'm really going to start targeting, plenty of folds. And so if you give me a 3, an overcard, like that King 3, that's just going to be like a really common hand type here. Now, you want to know how important unblocking the folds are? Look at what suit is preferred here. The best suit to barrel here is a spade. Why is that? Because clubs, hearts, and diamonds continue the flop more often than spades. Those hands with the backdoor flush draw continue flop and fold turn. The spades unblock the most folds. The computer's telling us, okay, that's a trigger. That is making it just slightly better for you to barrel the turn. So I hope that is helpful for you. I want to talk about one more concept. What about like bad turns for us? And the opponent's supposed to lead. So we bet big on the flop, which means that we super condense their range in this spot, right? And now we get a turn that is extremely bad for us. So bad for us that the out-of-position player now has 55% equity. Okay? That allows the out-of-position player to develop leads. And so if we blindly just look at this check node, it's going to say, okay, well, I have plenty of overpairs. I have plenty of pairs. I'm going to develop the same kind of strategy we're talking about, right? Like with this pretty polar range, I'm going to grab like my King 3, my Ace 2, my Ace 3. I'm going to try to unblock the opponent's folds here, I'm not going to barrel as many hands like an 8, Jack 8, King 8, Queen 8. I just want to realize my equity with those. That's kind of like our current process. But one thing in real life that people miss and they forget is the number one question in the spot is, does your opponent lead the turn? Because if somebody quickly checks, all of a sudden this 28% extra equity, or not extra equity, extra volume, extra hands gets put into their check range, and we need to be way more careful against their checks. So this is going to be very, very common. Like if you look like a 4, the opponent is going to develop a ton of this small lead size. They have plenty of equity. They now have the nut advantage. They turn plenty of trips, and so they lead 60% of the time. Now, if you just look at a quick computer on it, when they check, we go business as usual. Equities are close. I have plenty of nutted hands. Let me play a bet 60 in check strategy with a medium frequency. I'll choose my best bluffing candidates and my value hands. Well, if we move this frequency into the check range, we have to be more careful. And so what I'd like to do in game is maybe half this frequency, or bet 65% of this frequency, and be a little bit more careful. Now, this is where like your live skills and experience come into play. If somebody like snap checks the table and they didn't even think about leading, that can be very useful. If they take a while, they think about it, and then they check, maybe they were really thinking about leading and actually do have kind of a legit check strategy here. So I would be a little bit more weary to barrel hands like Queen Jack of Clubs, King Jack of Clubs. I would play more polar here than a computer will, simply because I think that when we bet, the opponent's just going to have more 4x here. They're going to have more hands. They're going to check shove on me like an 8-9, like a 5-6. And so they're going to be a little bit tougher to play against with a little bit stronger of a range. So I'm going to go back to my game theory concepts in that spot and focus on realizing my equity. So the last thing I'll say about adjusting, I felt this in game a lot, where if you're playing, if you're playing people that care more about not getting outdrawn, what is that going to lead them to do in different spots? It's going to lead them to fast play more. So if your opponents are going to check jam on you more often than a computer does, what should that do to your strategy? It should make it more polar. What happens if a player will never check jam on you, or a very low frequency? Well, in that case, betting with equity hurts you a lot less, because as long as you're unblocking folds and betting with equity, you're not getting jammed on at the right frequency, and so you get to realize that equity a bit more. When you bet 7.3 here on the turn, you are supposed to get jammed on 1/5 of the time. Over 20% of the time, you're supposed to get jammed on here. If that's 50%, you better adjust. If that's 10%, you also better adjust. So remember that these are all baselines, and we always want to be viewing this like it's extremely fluid, and you're just a creative figuring out how to push and pull your global frequencies and what hand types to pull from based on who you're playing in game. So hope that was helpful. We're going to get into delay C betting next. Thanks, guys.